Ready to go? Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China the World program here at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Our event today is an event about a book that I'm a co-author of, and I have a co-author here with me. The co-author is Professor Jack Lee Downey of the Religion Department of the University of Rochester. He also teaches at Attica Prison in upstate New York. The book we wrote was about his father, John T. Jack Downey, known as Jack Downey, a graduate of the Yale class of 1951, who signed on to become a paramilitary CIA officer in his senior year at Yale. And in 1952, the following year, along with his fellow officer, Richard Fecteau of Boston, was captured after their plane was shot down in Manchuria in late 1952, as I said, during the Korean War. He spent over 20 years in prison, and his release was negotiated by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon as part of the opening to the PRC in the early 1970s. And Mr. Downey would leave the Chinese prison on March 12, 1973. The book came about because after Mr. Downey's death in 2014, his family found a memoir that he had written in secret. The family wanted that memoir published at an academic press. I happen to be the editor of a series at Columbia University Press. I have been for several years, since before I came here as a professor. It's the Nancy Tucker and Warren Cohen series on America in Asia. So the topic seemed right. I initially looked at the memoir. It's beautifully written, fascinating, the stuff of movies, and I rejected it. So I rejected it because it wasn't scholarly in nature. It didn't have research behind it. It was the person's story, and it said it should definitely be published at a trade press. Family pushed back and said he really wanted to publish at an academic press. Can we figure out a way? So the solution I came up with was to think of several diplomatic historians who could write analytic chapters inserted in the memoir, analyzing international and domestic politics of the various phases of his saga. And then there would be research and primary sources, secondary sources, the kind of stuff of an academic press. So I gave the family the list of diplomatic historians that I thought were capable of doing it. And the family said, good idea, but we want you to do it. So they asked me to write the analytic chapters. I talked to my two children. I was working on another project at the time, and they said, you have to do this. So I said yes, and I'm really glad I did. And as part of our plan for the book, Jack Lee Downey, Mr. Downey's son, agreed to write an afterword about Mr. Downey's life after he was released from Chinese prison, which is really remarkable. He very quickly enrolled at Harvard Law School. He became a very successful lawyer, public servant, and judge in Connecticut. And there is a juvenile court in Connecticut named after him at this time, which it shows the kind of resilience that he had. And I'm grateful to the family, to Jack Lee, and to his mother, who allowed me to travel up to New Haven and look at the family archive for writing the book, and look at all the various notes and letters and other things that were involved. And I'm also grateful to Henry Kissinger, who afforded me an interview about this and amazingly remembered great detail of everything that happened, corrected me and said, no, that was the October trip, not the July trip. And I believe Dr. Kissinger is now 99 years old. It's an incredible thing. And he was very gracious with his time, and I learned a lot from the conversation. So I wanted to start the conversation today by talking about some of the lessons of his story. What can we draw from his story? And one of them is just kind of a metaphor for a nation, for the United States as a nation. Here you have a young guy at Yale, great athlete. He was on the football team. He was captain of the wrestling team. Didn't really have aspirations to go into international security politics in any way. He's on summer vacation in Alaska with his buddies, and Kim Il-sung's North Korea invades South Korea. And he says in his memoir that he didn't know where Korea was on the map, like he had never heard of Korea. But he did have these upper class, well, not really upper class, because he was a rising senior, but he had older classmates who had served in World War II. And in the class of 1951 at Yale, they really looked up to these people because they had saved the world from fascism. And they had done some really interesting things. And some of them had served in what was the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was the kind of precursor to the paramilitary branch of the CIA. When I say it's a metaphor for the nation, he kind of wakes up to the Cold War and decides to do something in his senior year. And America as a whole was not really engaged heavily in the Cold War until the Korean War broke out. Especially wasn't engaged in the Cold War until China entered the Cold War and engaged US troops in terms of national effort. Other things had happened before. The Marshall Plan had happened before the Korean War. NATO was formed before the Korean War. But the amount of funding for these types of programs were relatively small compared to what they would be in 1951 after the first 6 months of the Korean War. And I see his kind of getting brought into this world as an individual, as a kind of metaphor for the American nation being mobilized. And it was a gigantic mistake for Mao and Stalin to give the green light to Kim Il-sung from a kind of Cold War competitive strategy to get all these people engaged in this struggle. The U.S. defense budget will triple within 7 months from June of 1950 to early 1951, which is really astounding. And it was such a high, it was almost 14% of GNP, 14 to 15% of GNP in early 1951, which is 5 times the percentage of GNP that it is today, at a much smaller GNP. So anyone who's an economist would know that people, regular American citizens, were sacrificing quite a bit to cover this. And Mao also gets manipulated by Stalin to bail Kim Il-sung out once the invasion fails. And then China gets involved in the war, has 1 million casualties, 260,000 dead, loses Taiwan because it was in the early Korean War period that Truman changed his strategy towards Taiwan to protecting Taiwan. And I think probably the worst prize was he inherited North Korea. And the PRC still has to live with that burden of being the protector of North Korea, which has been a headache, I think, for the Chinese government ever since. So looking up at his older classmates, Jack Downey gets recruited at a meeting at a professor's house. And the class of 1951 had, I think, dozens of people who signed up to serve in relatively adventuristic branches of the US government to fight this new Cold War so that they could do their part like their older classmates had done. The OPC itself, this is the Office of Political Control. I should have coordination, Office of Political Coordination, which was the branch of the CIA that did the paramilitary operations, was even younger than the young CIA. It was only a few years old, but it would grow in the early Cold War years as a kind of example of how the United States gets heavily engaged, from 300 officers in 1949 to 2,200 officers in 1952. So that's the surge that Jack Downey was part of when he signed up. So a second lesson that I think is in there is that through the OPC, the Office of Political Coordination at the CIA, the United States was really fighting the last war. They were seeing the OSS from World War II as the example of a successful organization that really cost the enemy a lot and helped the United States and its allies win the struggle against the Soviet Union. Against the Nazis, against the Nazi Germany and fascist Japan. But one of the differences between that experience and the experience of the OPC in China was that the countries in which the OSS was operating were occupied by foreign forces. So they were able to link up with local forces who wanted foreigners out of their country. In the case of China, the Chinese communists were Chinese, and but by its very nature, it was very difficult to find organized Chinese to get rid of them. And a second difference is that the Chinese communists were Leninists, and they were revolutionaries, and they were obsessed with domestic control. So the situation was much less porous for foreigners to penetrate and organize resistance against the government that was run by Leninists. And they ran into huge problems inserting, and this is what Mr. Downey did, inserting former KMT nationalist officers into mainland China to cause insurrection, to cause sabotage, and to cause the Chinese communists trouble. Most of these, basically all of them, were either killed or rolled up. There was really no success story. Later in the 1950s, the United States will be doing this similar operations in Tibet with Tibetan guerrillas, the Mustangs, without a lot more success, although they gained probably more intelligence than their counterparts in Northeast China during the Korean War. A third problem with the analogy to the OSS in World War II is that the reason the OSS was successful in helping win the war for World War II for the United States and its allies was that it was a total war to the death, basically. It was a war of total surrender, unconditional surrender. And in that kind of war, any type of operation anywhere that affects the cost-benefit ratio of the enemy helps bring the enemy down. So OSS operators in Serbia, in Poland, in France, could all cost the Germans something. And as long as it cost the Germans more than it cost the Americans to send them in, then it was helping bring down the Nazi empire. And most measures, they caused more trouble than it cost the United States to send them in. And there was no real parallel in the Korean War, particularly the time that Mr. Downey entered the Korean War in late 1952. It was already firmly a limited war. The two sides had settled into a bloody stalemate at the 38th parallel. And the only thing that was really keeping the war going was the inability of the two sides to come to an agreement on how to exchange prisoners of war. In that kind of situation, even if you cost the Chinese communists more on the mainland through inserting people in there, you're not going to cost them so much that they can't continue to support the North in a slow, grinding war. And the war was never going to be such that the US was going to try to take advantage of any temporary weakness and seize new land. They just had to come up with some way to negotiate the prisoners to be exchanged to end the war. And that lasted 2 years, that process of negotiating over the POWs, from the middle part of 1951 to July of 1953, when there was an armistice. And we can talk in the Q&A about how they reached that armistice and why Mr. Downey would not be included in that POW exchange. And that's a big part of his story and why he spent so much time in prison. There was also a lot of hubris and poor preparation in the early Cold War by the United States, in that I think the United States felt like it was invincible after World War II, and that if it just threw a lot of attention and resources at a problem, it would solve it. And the difference between the OSS in World War II and Mr. Downey's operation in China is that the United States had a generation of first generation immigrant families in various parts of the United States, that the hometown language was the local language in Europe, and people really only studied English in school, and they were totally fluent in a range of European languages, and they looked like the local population. So you could take someone who spoke Serbo-Croatian or Polish, and you could insert them into Nazi-controlled territory, and they could blend in. And they knew something about the culture, they knew how to act, they knew how to hide. Mr. Downey had no background in China. He was a Caucasian American of Irish descent, and he had dedication, he had brain power, he wanted to help, and he was put in charge of a bunch of Chinese agents to insert into China to do these operations. But he says in his memoir, and he says in his debrief at the CIA, which the family shared with me, that he was puzzled, like, why was he doing this? He didn't know the geography of China. He didn't know the history of China. He didn't know the politics of China. He didn't know Chinese language, but he was ordering these people into China to do their mission. And he said they knew much more about their mission than I did, but I was the boss, and that's just the way it worked. And then sending him into China was truly idiotic, for lack of a more technical term. And I'll talk about how that happened, but he stuck out like a sore thumb if captured, no language capabilities, and his plane would get shot down. And it was also stupid to send him in because he knew all about the operations. So he had way too much information to be sent into harm's way in China. And he had no way to escape if he was sent into harm's way in China and got shot down. And that's exactly what happened. So he ends up confessing and talking about the operations, as one would predict. And that seemed like a series of mistakes. Then there's something that people who work in the US government will appreciate, which is a real, when American English, they say snafu, a real government screw up that gets this highly informed person without the proper background into harm's way. And that is that they inserted these former KMT soldiers into Manchuria to sow discord and collect intelligence. And they had a radio, and they contacted back to their home base in Japan, and they said, we're ready to have one of us pulled out with the information. And they said, okay, we'll pull them out. And they had a method, and it sounds crazy, but the method was to stick 2 poles in the ground with a rope across it and hook the person to the rope in the middle and have an aircraft, a propeller aircraft, fly at extremely low altitude with a hook on it, catch the rope and yank the guy into the air. Now, I do a lot of work in Washington, and I described this to one of my friends who's a special forces guy. He goes, oh yeah, I've done that twice. It's a real jolt. So people actually do this. People actually do this. But that was the plan, was to go in and yank this KMT officer up into the sky and pull him back to Japan. We had to get him into the plane and then fly back to Japan. So all well and good. So they had 2 brave pilots. They were World War II vets, one former Marine, one former Navy pilot, going to fly this lumbering cargo plane with the propellers at a low altitude, catch this guy. But they needed someone in the back of the plane to work a winch to pull the guy into the plane. Now, why would you send 2 highly informed people with high-level clearances into that position? Only the US government can do this. Maybe not only US government, maybe only governments can do this, to be fair. And that is that they had 2 technicians who knew how to work the winch, who didn't know much about the operation, who wouldn't be able to disclose a lot about what the United States was doing in Northeast China at the time, but their clearances weren't high enough. The mission was so secretive that they weren't able to go on the mission because you had to have the highest level clearances. Who had the highest level clearances? These 2 athletes who could work the winch, if they trained them, right? They had the physical capability, and that was Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau. Mr. Fecteau was also a football player in college, so they put them on the plane, and they very cheerfully, agreed to go on this mission. And of course, all of the people they had dropped in had been turned by Chinese security forces, so it was a setup. And when the plane came down, they got shot. The 2 pilots were killed, and the 2 people in the back of the plane were immediately captured, Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau. So then another thing is about why they were there for so long, and that this is a lesson about Chinese politics, a lesson about the CCP as an organization, and also about the value of direct diplomatic relations with all countries, including enemies. And one of the reasons they spent a long time in jail was that they were spies. They weren't prisoners of war. They weren't uniformed officers, even though they had both trained at Fort Benning in Georgia, where elite forces still train to this day. So they were trained like soldiers, but they weren't uniformed soldiers. But perhaps more important from the Chinese Communist Party perspective, in China, national security is really state security. And there's a problem in the Chinese language, or a convenience in the Chinese language, in which state security and national security are the same term. So the government can say we're really about national security, but it's really about state security. And they're Leninists, and they're very concerned about regime security. So someone who's trying to overthrow the state in China is considered a much bigger threat than someone who fights Chinese forces in Korea. So they were never going to be treated by the Chinese communists as normal POWs. And when the armistice was settled in Korea in July 1953 over an exchange of POWs, they were never going to be included in that. And even the US government didn't try to include them in normal POW negotiations, in part because the Eisenhower administration, which is the administration that discovered they were still alive in 1954, because they were presumed dead, didn't want any kind of contact with them and didn't want to compromise the ability to get some other combatants who were actually uniformed combatants out of China by including them in the mix. Right? So no direct US diplomatic relations with the PRC meant that Washington could only negotiate with the Chinese communists in the middle 1950s through US diplomats and PRC diplomats in third countries. So there were talks in Geneva in the middle 1950s. There's very good records of these negotiations on both sides. Between Hugh Alexis Johnson, a US ambassador in Europe, and Wang Bingnan, who was the Chinese ambassador to Poland, and who would travel to Geneva to negotiate with Hugh Alexis Johnson about the disposition of Americans in China and Chinese in America. That was their task. There were other things added to it. The Chinese wanted various embargoes lifted on China. The United States wanted the PRC to renounce the use of force against Taiwan. So there were other elements to it, but that was their real main mission, was to come up with a way that people who wanted to go back to China, to mainland China from the United States, could find a way back, and people who wanted to come back to the United States from mainland China could come back. But then you have these really difficult cases, these two spies who were captured and now have been tried, have confessed, and have been tried in court. And Mr. Downey had been given a life sentence in 1954. So there were negotiations, and it seemed like the sticking points from the Chinese side were the level of diplomatic contact that they could secure from the United States, the admission by the United States that the two were spies, which was really important to them. And then in late 1956, early 1957, Zhou Enlai proposed the exchange of journalists as a kind of icebreaker between the two sides, saying that PRC journalists could come to the United States and the United States could send journalists to China. And up until then, up until that point in early 1957, the United States wasn't allowing anybody to go to China, to the PRC. Journalists wanted to go, and they were threatened with sanctions by the Treasury Department for trading with the enemy. They brought money with them, which they have to do. So they weren't allowed to go. And even Mrs. Downey, Mr. Downey's mother, Mary Downey, was not allowed to go to visit her son until 57, even though the Chinese communists had offered to the UN that prisoners like Mr. Downey, Mr. Fecteau could have their family come as early as 1955. So I read Wang Bingnan's memoir again. I had read it before for an earlier book that I wrote. And I got hold of the instructions that Wang Bingnan was operating under, the instructions from Beijing for the negotiations. And I looked at the family history, and Mr. Downey was told after he was released in 1975, he went back. Was it 1982 that you went back as a kid with him? 83. 83. Okay, 83, they went back to China. And his host on that trip was Wang Bingnan, the person who had negotiated with the Americans. Mr. Downey's host was, and he said to him, you know, your name was on my lips a lot, and it's really upsetting because President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles refused our outreach, and if we had just exchanged journalists in early 1957, you could have been released at that point. We were ready to do that. A reporter heard this, a Connecticut reporter, Hartford Rossner, is that it? Barbara Rossner, I think it was. So she heard this and she called Alexis Johnson and said, was this ever on the table? And he said, no. And he said, this was a long time ago. Let's not talk about it. Apparently, it was a very painful experience for him. And I can talk about why it was difficult for him as a diplomat because of the instructions he was given from Washington. He was very constrained in what he could and couldn't do. And he said, well, there's no direct offer. And I looked through all the minutes of the discussions, the cables back to Washington, and I saw no direct offer. But what Wang Bingnan says in his memoir is that the Chinese were offering the journalism exchange as an icebreaker. They had another icebreaker 2 years earlier when they released the crew of a U.S. aircraft that was part of a spying effort. And they had released them, and then they were going to do the journalists, and they were preparing to release Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau. And they said that they were trying to create the right environment, which is something that Chinese diplomats say to this day. If you want to work together on North Korea, we need the proper environment. We shouldn't have trouble over Taiwan this month, this type of thing. So it's a very typical way of speaking. But I found evidence from the memoir itself that suggests it was true, that they were really willing to let Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau go. And that was that Mr. Downey was taken on a tour of China in 1956 to see various parts of the new China, obviously propagandistic tour, right? But they were trying to convince him that the revolution was a good thing for China and that he should think good thoughts about China. Mr. Downey had a life sentence. So why would they bother to show him the new China if they weren't preparing to let him go? Right, so that fit the story as well. And I became convinced that Ambassador Wang Bingnan was telling Mr. Downey the truth in 1983, and that it was the stubbornness of the Eisenhower administration and Secretary of State Dulles to limit all contacts with the PRC, people-to-people contacts and diplomatic contacts, and to refuse the Chinese Communist request that they upgrade these ambassadorial level talks to ministerial level talks to pound out various issues, including your father's incarceration. And then you see, if you think about it as a social scientist, and I'll close with this, which is how he actually gets released, you see a different approach by the United States and what it produces. Now, a lot of things changed in the world from the 1950s to the Nixon administration, but from 1968 to 71, those global changes really provided both the Chinese government the incentive and the United States the opportunity to change the approach in the diplomacy. And the Kissinger-Nixon outreach to China from 71 to 72 provided an opportunity to negotiate directly with Zhou Enlai and with Mao over the fate of Jack Lee's father and Mr. Fecteau. And private citizens were able to get into the act. So Professor Jerry Cohen, a law professor now at NYU, at the time at Harvard, who was a classmate of Mr. Downey, publicly calls for the US to admit that they were spies. All through the Eisenhower administration, they said that there were civilians working for the army and the plane got lost, right? They just ended up in the wrong place, right? The Chinese knew this was false because not only had they caught the other agents that they had sent in who told them what it was about, but Mr. Downey had confessed, but the US government kept saying that they weren't spies, right? They weren't trying to cause sabotage or anything else. And he made these public claims and said they are spies, and the US government should accept it. And then there was the ping pong diplomacy that you've seen in Forrest Gump, Tom Hanks playing tennis and table tennis, and and the National Committee of US-China Relations inviting the team for the next year. So you had these people-to-people contacts, exactly what Zhou Enlai was trying to create with the journalists, right? And then there was a great deal of secrecy, and the Kissinger and Nixon, National Security Advisor Kissinger and President Nixon kept the discussions about Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau very secret, but they persistently raised the case. And this caused some real problems with the family because the family thought they had been forgotten, right? Mr. Fecteau gets out in late 71, but Mr. Downey doesn't. And Mrs. Downey, the mother, thinks they forgot him. And they felt like they couldn't talk about it. And I have to agree that they had reason not to talk about it. because they were asking for the release on purely humanitarian grounds. They basically said, you're right, they were spies. They were trying to overthrow your government. All governments frown upon that and prosecute people who do it. They were guilty as charged, but it would be really helpful to our patching up of relations if you let them go. But it'll be a humanitarian gesture and we'll treat it as such. If Mr. Kissinger or Dr. Kissinger came back to America in 71, July 71, and President Nixon came back in February 72 and said, we asked the Chinese to release these guys, it would look like pressure. It would look like the Chinese government was under pressure. And I think their logic was you had to give the Chinese government the chance to let them out on humanitarian grounds and get full credit for humanitarian release. So it didn't look like the big US hegemon was forcing them to release this as a prerequisite for any kind of cooperation in the Cold War. And I think that that was right, but it did cause real problems. And I'd say the real lesson of the book is that direct diplomatic contact and some degree of sincerity in the negotiations between even enemies can produce better results. I think it's a real tragedy that Mr. Downey had to spend an additional 15 years in a Chinese prison because we couldn't work out that kind of an arrangement. And I give the Nixon administration great credit for doing it, but there's one person who deserves a lot of credit who I haven't mentioned except in passing, and that's Jack Lee's grandmother, Mary Downey, who ended up visiting her son on several occasions and comported herself with great courage and style and diplomacy, and was very diplomatic with the officials with whom she interacted. And then when she came home, she didn't, read them the riot act in the newspapers and stuff. And I think if that had been different, maybe he wouldn't have been released in 73, because it was the occasion of her stroke and severe illness that the Chinese government took the opportunity to make the humanitarian release. And I think if their relationship with her hadn't been as positive as it were, they might not have done it. And so regular people matter in diplomacy, and she certainly mattered. And she's one of the unsung heroes of the story. And I think she's kind of maybe a sung hero of the story. So anyway, I'll turn it over to you to talk about your dad after his release and your experience with him. I spoke for a little bit longer than I wanted. I apologize, but I look at this audience and I'm excited about the project and I couldn't stop.
Thanks, Tom. So essentially everything that Tom talked about is his contribution to the book. If you just took my father's memoir and my bit, it would make no sense to anybody contextually who didn't already know quite a bit about the history of the Korean War. And I think that's like increasingly common, that knowledge is kind of receding from, especially American consciousness, at least. I'm not a scholar of diplomacy or China and the United States. I'm a historian of modern Catholicism. So you're not my target audience normally. This is also
You could convert people.
That is very much not the type of research that I do. This is also, I'm not used to talking about things that are this personal to me. Normally I talk about other dead people, not my father. And we are approaching the 8th anniversary of his death. And which is really, in a sense, like the genesis of this project. I think for at least most of my life, people had been pitching him on books and films. And our family had been kind of like passionately defending him against these advances, because he and his partner, Dick Fecteau, when they were released, or once my dad was released, Dick Fecteau was already back, they had kind of made a pact that they didn't want to profit additionally from what happened to them, which I don't think I would have done. I probably would have taken that to the bank, but I think it says something about their integrity. But also, I think neither of them really wanted to live their latter years being re-traumatized by their experiences, and it was true that like once my father, he died of pancreatic cancer, which if you know anything about pancreatic cancer, it kind of hits fast and quick. And by the time he was diagnosed, he was given a year to live, and then he lived less than 2 months. And towards the latter stage of that 2 months, which he was in like remarkably good spirits almost the entire time about, which was like also, I think, says something about his character and his comfort with being uncomfortable. He really started to warm to the idea that like this could be my problem. he didn't want to have to deal with the book project, but like, wouldn't it be nice if like this thing, and I didn't know at the time that there was this memoir around, in addition to a box of his letters to his mother from when he was in prison, which my mother then unearthed, in like a cold winter alone in New Haven in an empty house. Now, none of this book would have made sense though without Tom's contribution, because it really is, if you look at my dad's materials, it's my life in prison, and without Tom, it wouldn't make sense. This wouldn't be really publishable as a standalone, I don't think, at least not in the way that we had wanted it to be. And so could not be more grateful to Tom for his kind of collegial contribution to this, and also just the enduring kind of like oomph to get it across the finish line. Maybe a couple of quick anecdotes, and then we can open it up to Q&A. So, on one hand, in 2005, by the time my dad died, he'd gotten like way too many Lifetime Achievement Award type of things, and towards the end of his life, the CIA started giving him and Dick Fecteau multiple awards, and he was getting awards from these other places, and he was being honored in this way that I think made him feel very uncomfortable, even though he was grateful for the attention in some way. I did not expect to like visit the CIA headquarters multiple times, like my 30s. And one of the ones that sticks out to me though is in 2005, Yale gave him an award named after Nathan Hale, of the Revolutionary War, other famous spy who was captured. And one of the things that was interesting about that was, on one hand, my dad was very kind of dry humored about the whole event. It's like, why do I keep getting awards for getting captured? I abjectly failed at my job. But I think it was the way that he failed, which is why people gave him awards, and he and Dick Fecteau both emerged in like really remarkably good condition psychologically. When my dad was released, the newspapers were kind of obsessed with describing his body in a way that I just find fascinating, because he came out weighing 190 pounds, which was about 5 pounds less than he went in. And the newspapers were kind of like bragging about how many push-ups a day he did and all of these things. But by and large, I think more importantly, both he and Fecteau went on to lead, I guess, like kind of like by most estimations, like very successful lives post-release.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they had better careers than I've had, and I never went to prison. But they also, I think, were incredibly gentle and like well socialized, is a weird way of putting it. But you wouldn't know that they had spent time in prison at all, let alone an enormous amount of time. And in 2005, when we had this Nathan Hale Award, a couple of things struck me. One, afterwards, we retired to this old Yale kind of eating club for lunch with all of my dad's classmates who had returned for it. And we were sitting around this massive old wooden table. And one of them turns to me and he says, everyone here besides you is a spook, right? So it really, like, the entire, like a huge swath of the class joined the CIA, and they had almost no idea what each other had done for at least 10 years after college, except for my dad. And everyone knew everything that he had done because it was highly reported upon. But I think that said something interesting about the climate in terms of CIA recruitment from Ivy League schools during that period in time, and also just like what it's like to be as like a young person leaving college and then going into this kind of black hole, where you're actively lying to like all of your friends and your family. But there was another thing that happened, which was that my dad was like, for all of the social like upward mobility that the CIA gave me, he was a scholarship student and things like that. He's like, going to Yale really screwed me, because he had been pegged as the leader because he had gone to Yale and Dick Fecteau had gone to BU. And so just let that be a lesson to everyone who's soon to get an Ivy League graduate degree. Yeah.
He got the longer sentence because they said, he must be the leader. He went to Yale.
Potentially
hadn't heard of BU.
Potentially an exponentially longer sentence, 20 years versus life. I mean, neither of them are anything you would want, but and then the last memory from that event was that, it was open to the public in downtown New Haven, and one of my childhood hockey teammates' dads had shown up, and afterwards he came up to me and he was like crying, and this is a 60-year-old like heavily bearded Santa Claus looking person. And he's like, I never knew any of this. And he had spent at least 13 years seeing my dad like 4 times, 5 times a week. And he had never heard any of this because my dad never talked about it. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that even my information about my dad's life came anecdotally, you know, through little bits and pieces of information and like little crumbs that I would get, or eventually little bits of information that people would tell me about my dad. For an enormous amount, and this is maybe my Catholic studies kind of orientation, but for enormous a number of Catholics in Connecticut, where my dad was from, he had been someone that they'd been forced to pray for daily during their childhood in parochial school. And so there was, by the time he returned home, there was this like a generation of Connecticuters that had been like conditioned to think of him as a superhero, kind of, you know, and at least like a saint in the war against the Cold War, or against, you know, against the Soviet Union or communism, you know. And so that was like it was a very interesting way of slowly understanding information about him that eventually became more congealed through reading the memoir. And most of the information I knew, but it had always been given to me piecemeal. So I think there's maybe one last thing I'll say before we turn it over, which is just on the notion of maybe circling back to diplomacy. So in 1974, when my dad had enrolled in Harvard Law School, Yale Law School had rejected him for reasons that he was
extracurricular activity was really good.
Is consistently bitter about. So my dad went to Harvard, and at that point he had already met my mom, who's originally from Shenyang. And I think there's some like psychoanalysis that you could do with my family about my father leaving China and then marrying a Chinese person. But really, I think for him, actually, the re-entry from prison, it was like very difficult to acclimate to white American society. And so my mother being Chinese was actually like a crucial part, not just of like their courtship, but of his ability to kind of slowly morph back into freedom. But this is just a back and forth between this historian, James White, who's interviewing him. So James White says, okay, well, I think that about covers what I had in mind. This is at the end of the interview. Obviously, you don't have any bitterness towards anyone, do you? John Downey: no, I don't, come to think of it. I mean, I would say that's an honest statement, not even the Chinese for that matter. Question: not towards the guy that sent you out? Answer: no, I wouldn't say so. I felt for him. It turned out to be such a goddamn disaster from his point of view as well. Question: and the final would be so-called lessons besides not getting caught. Do you have any words of wisdom on that? Answer: gosh, I don't know. I mean, I understand things have changed greatly in the whole orientation, but I've been brainwashed or changed to the extent that I think it's just not well to put in time trying to overthrow other people's governments if you're not in a state of war with them, you know? I mean, that's the whole, I think really restricting intelligence agency work to intelligence probably in the long run is the better move. But that's not very, very profound. I don't have any other great insights. So I think that, you know, that was where my dad came down on it, really was.
I think he earned that opinion.
Yeah. That was like, he was a very tempered speaker, you know. So that's a little bit about his personality, I think, which is what I'm an expert in. So thanks.
Thanks a lot. Any questions that the audience has? And I think, Dan, you're going to be able to handle online ones as well. Probably not, you're getting dinner ready for us. But anyway, here for Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I was in the auditorium when your dad spoke at CIA because I was still there then.
Me too. I was.
Wish I had written then, but there's a lot of comical circle things here. Your last comment about what your dad said about maybe we shouldn't be in the business of overthrowing regimes. Believe me, there is an ongoing debate you can read about in newspapers today. There's like the old guard among the director of operations people who recruit spies. And a lot of them say we should not be in the paramilitary business. We shouldn't be running covert ops. We shouldn't be flying drones. We shouldn't be doing kinetic things. We're spies. We should be recruiting people to gather intelligence, period.
Yeah.
And then there's other people who say, the White House wants this paramilitary capability. Sometimes we can work more effectively in the military, sometimes not, and it's not, but it's an actually current issue. So I was struck
Yeah.
you picked that quote, and I do remember you in, I think Mr. Fecteau was there. You
Fecteau
were
was there, yeah,
right?
right.
I remember being blown away by the story the first time I heard it, but I hadn't heard all the details that Tom just provided. But Tom, I have a question.
Yeah.
So during the Eisenhower era, when the issue came up of a possible trade via the journalists context,
Right.
did the issue come up about anybody at CIA worried that we acknowledged this guy was a journalist? Or we then tarring every other journalist in the world with potentially now being perceived by our adversaries as CIA people? That's an ongoing thing that changed later. That's an absolute policy. You cannot use journalism as a cover.
Okay, yeah, no, it didn't come up for two reasons. One is that Mr. Downey wasn't a journalist, and I don't think anybody was thinking of using the U.S. journalists. There were a bunch of actual journalists who wanted to go.
Uh-huh.
And when Joe and I publicly said, America should send journalists to China, we can send journalists to the United States, Dulles said no. He said it's blackmail. That was his public reaction. It's blackmail. And Mr. Downey will learn about that in his prison cell. He gets an almanac, a 1958 almanac that says in early 1957, Dulles labeled this offer blackmail. And he was alert enough about international relations to say that was a nail in my coffin, right? So the idea wasn't to use CI people in the journalism exchange. It was, we don't want to send journalists to China because that's a way of recognizing the legitimacy of the PRC. And we're certainly not going to have a bunch of commie journalists come to the United States and run around our country. You know, that was the attitude. And the one thing that's really interesting is your organization, the CIA, they were willing to admit that these guys were spies if it would get them out. And it was the rest of the administration that said, no, we have to stick with the cover story, say that they're being badly treated, and we can't negotiate the ways that the communists wanted to negotiate, because remember, we just formed an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek's Taiwan, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were watching over the shoulder, and they didn't want any kind of they knew about these Geneva talks, and they were very nervous that the Geneva talks would escalate to higher level talks or lead to some kind of justification. So they were so resistant that, and this is why I say Alexis Johnson apparently was traumatized by his mission. And I met people who met him, he's passed away, but that had met him after his retirement, who said that this was one of the worst missions he had. He had served in Thailand, all over the world. He was a very accomplished diplomat, and he wrote a memoir, including a chapter on this. But the resistance in the US was so strong that they came up with a method by which Chinese citizens could be informed that they had an opportunity to go back to mainland China, and American citizens in China, including prisoners, could be informed that they had an outreach to find a way back to the United States. And the Chinese had suggested that the United States authorize the Indian government to be the contact for Chinese citizens in America, because there was Indian representation, and that the United States authorized the British government to be the go-between for the American citizens in China. And Alexis Johnson wanted to accept this. He thought it was going to be a breakthrough, that it would provide a real outlet. And Dulles and it was Dulles with Eisenhower's approval, said you cannot use the word authorize. They can't be representatives. The Indians can't be representatives of the PRC because we don't recognize the PRC. And the British can't be representatives of the United States in the PRC because we don't recognize the PRC. All we can do is invite the Indians and the British to play a constructive role along these lines. And Wang Mingnan said, why can't we authorize? You know, why can't you treat us like we're actually a government? And they kept saying no. And the eventual agreement said invite. So the US won on that. But it showed just how sensitive the Eisenhower administration was about anything that lent any kind of officiality to the PRC. and the China lobby on the Hill and other things. There's another book out about the Mr. Downey's case that came out at the exact same time. Bizarre. A historian, John Delury, a Yale trained historian, wrote a book, and he talks less about his case and less about the details of the negotiations that I talked about, and more about that domestic environment in the United States that was the Eisenhower administration felt like it was constrained by or was feeding, and how different it was under President Nixon.
If I could just,
Yeah, go ahead.
so, the quote, from the end of the book that my father gave from 1974. I mean, I think the underlying thing, right, is that he's essentially saying, like, maybe the entire branch of the CIA that he was a part of, like, shouldn't exist anymore, right? I mean, that's like the subtle thing that he's pointing out, which we now call Special Activities Branch, right? And there were the two times that I went to CIA with my father. One was 2010, when for people that don't know, there was a documentary that was put out about my father and Dick Fecteau for internal use only. Although that lasted
It's on YouTube, man.
that lasted a very brief amount of time because of a FOIA request, because they invited one member of the Associated Press in, which opened some floodgates. But initially it was, as I understand it, and this is like just what Leon Panetta told me, so I don't know, but is that the whole film series was built up by the CIA's Center for the Study of Intelligence, which is their history wing, to essentially educate newer members on the history of the CIA, so they weren't just relying on Hollywood films and books like Legacy of Ashes and things like that. The second time we went was when my father and Dick Fecteau received the Distinguished Intelligence Cross in 2013. And at that point in time, part of I will say that the CIA always treated my father and Dick Fecteau, really nicely, and they would schedule all these different meetings with the China desk people and the current special activities leadership. But the presentation in 2013, they had a video that Special Activities had put together that was a kind of like action video showing all sorts of like paramilitary incursions that they had done, and it was like very theatrical and Hollywood production. And both my dad and Mr. Fecteau were kind of like aghast, because that was like exactly the opposite of what they had hoped would happen with Special Activities. So yeah.
Was that right? So Mr. Fecteau became the director of athletics at BU, where he played football, and he's still alive.
Yeah.
I didn't never had the chance to meet him, but
Yeah, wonderful man. And I think my mom and I feel pretty strongly about this, that my father has always kind of overshadowed Dick in terms of popular acclaim and also just awareness. Partly, I think my dad was the last one to get out, and so that was maybe reported on indifferently. But also, my father's classmates from Yale did kind of unimaginable yeoman's work over the course of 2 decades trying to maintain his story in the news. And I think that largely had the effect of kind of propelling my dad into the front. Whereas Fecteau is also not a limelight seeker, so I don't think he feels particularly bad that people aren't bothering him as much. But I don't think he's ever really gotten as much attention as he deserves.
Thank you. This is such a fascinating story. I wonder if you would mind speaking a little bit more, just from a human psychology point of view. It's hard to imagine, a young man, in that setting. Obviously must have been, I haven't yet read the book, I apologize, but obviously must have been in solitary confinement, must have had terrible hardships. What do you think accounts for him being able to obtain his sanity and his ability to come through that sort of intact?
Well, I think
you have yours.
I have a mic. Thank you. Sorry. A few different things changed over. I mean, obviously, it's to say the least, over the course of 20 years. I work with incarcerated people, so this is actually, I think, maybe like a universally true thing for people who have their liberty removed, which which is that the beginning is the worst, because you still have so many connections and hopes and expectations, and you haven't adjusted to the idea that prison is like your life now. Also, additionally, he hadn't been sentenced for a couple of years, and so there was this liminal period where he didn't know what was happening to him, but he also felt like he was being treated less well. Ultimately, once he's sentenced, he says the food got better, things got easier in a way. He was also presumed dead for the first couple of years too, and so once he was sentenced, he was also able to receive mail and have relationships kind of back and forth between his family and, in some cases, his classmates. But I think once he was sentenced, he really talked about it as thinking like, well, in a fairly matter-of-fact way, like, this is my world now, and I need to organize it in a particular way to live, and not simply be kind of like experiencing social death or something like that, and my dad became very like OCD almost. And the interesting thing with my dad and Dick Fecteau is that they had almost completely opposite ways of dealing with solitary confinement and regular confinement. They weren't in solitary the whole time, but they did have long stretches. And my father became incredibly organized, which actually in his later life was not the case. And he would count the days by doing pull-ups, and up until he got to his maximum. So, by the time he was released, he was able to do 100 pull-ups, which is like not what I can do. And he attempted to teach himself Russian. He learned it improperly for the first like 5 years or so, which is very much like my father. He's not a linguist, but he just became very regimented, and Fecteau, on the other hand, actually, according to him, kind of retreated into his mind a lot and really constructed almost like a kind of daydream state for himself. He also was very antagonistic to the guards, which I think is not what he's like either. So maybe my dad used to be organized and ended up being very disorganized as a free person. Dick Fecteau became very aggressive as an incarcerated person, but became very docile when he was released. And I think partially, I think for him, the aggression, I mean, is totally reasonable for someone who's incarcerated. But I think also gave him a sort of sense of like enduring defiance, But once my dad was able to start receiving mail, things became much easier for him, and became extremely demanding of my grandmother when it came to sending him food packages. So a lot of his letters to my grandmother are like lists of non-perishable food items. And she had actually converted her kitchen into essentially like a post office that had a weigh station because everything had to be weighed. And he kept up a lot with things happening at Yale. So he would receive the Yale Alumni magazine. He attempted to keep up with Yale football, which is his lifelong obsession. So
he said in the memoir that when he had a really hard day, he would travel back to defeating Harvard in Cambridge in the rain and snow. When he was on the varsity team. And that was a happy memory for him, and he would constantly return to them.
But was it? I mean, like the only really enduring. I'm sure there were more. My mother would probably be able to speak to this in a different way, as his spouse. But for me, the only really enduring signs of trauma were very light. He would speak to himself. He talked to himself a lot, and I just assumed growing up that was normal. That you would, you essentially lock yourself in the bathroom and just have like a full conversation with yourself at your normal outdoor voice for an hour on end. And occasionally, I would, as I was getting older and walking around town, I would see him kind of parked in the car alone, and he would spend a lot of time in closed spaces alone, which is some residual effect. But by and large, I mean, it was really kind of incredible how simply he kind of came out, and was able to really, I mean, readjusting to things like highways that hadn't existed, or paying for the bus. But he ended up going to graduate school within a year after returning, which is kind of remarkable even for people getting out of undergrad. So.
Well, you want to use the mic so that people on the
Cat question, did he master?
Did not master it.
No, he learned a few terms, but apparently not much. Yeah.
He had some of the reporting at the time said that he came out speaking Mandarin and being like fully literate in Russian, which I think is overselling it. You know, he was able to speak enough Mandarin to talk about me behind my back with my mother. You know, I mean, so he had some sort of conversational Mandarin, but he didn't have a lot of opportunities to speak, you know. I think it was a mixed match. Yeah. No. I mean, he was essentially a college football player who went to military camp. And then, I mean, he was more qualified to teach weapons training than he was to teach anything having to do with China, which is essentially what his job was.
Yeah.
I have a question about.
Sure.
Yeah, and correct me for wrong understanding. But, my understanding was that Mao was ready, he had his troops in Fujian, he was ready. And the invasion of South Korea by the North was a kind of diversionary tactic to divert U.S. attention away from the and, create, in a sense, another front. In the meantime, China had been petitioning the UN for membership, and the UN refused, and Russia boycotted. So now a new element came that the UN now is supporting the US, so it would not be as much a diversion. And so it kind of backfired. And so in the end, Mao moved his troops up to Dongbei, eventually, and then the South. The US progressed closer to China's border, and China put a force into the war. But one of the legacies, and it's very interesting, there are two Chinas and there are two Koreas.
Yeah.
And they're related. And the sense that my feeling was the Chinese position on North and South Korea's, we will not resolve the two Koreas problem until the two China's problem, which was the origin of the Korean problem, is solved. So is there any way that's a credible interpretation of how long?
You're not all wrong. You're only partially wrong, but you got most of it right. The one part that isn't right is that the Korean War was a diversion by Mao for an eventual attack on Taiwan. He was preparing forces across the. It was a civil war. They had consolidated control of most of the mainland, except for the Southwest. And Deng Xiaoping was out in the Southwest, consolidating in the Southwest. And he was preparing for an attack on Taiwan, which would have been very, very difficult because they had almost no Navy, almost no Air Force, but they were building up forces. And then they got. I think Mao gets snookered. He gets tricked into supporting Kim Il-sung's invasion to South Korea. And the way that worked is Kim Il-sung was asking Stalin and Mao as early 1949 to approve of an invasion of South Korea. And they kept saying no. Now, because he was still fighting a civil war in the mainland, he hadn't even created the PRC yet. Stalin, because he didn't want a war with the United States over Korea, because Korea wasn't that important to him. And he already had the northern part, which was important to him. And then in late January 1950, Kim Il-sung asks again, Stalin, I really want to invade the South. And look, the United States isn't backing Chiang Kai-shek, and Korea is not on the defense perimeter, all this stuff. There was a lot of signals from the United States that they didn't care that much about Korea. And Stalin said something that was what bad parents do with their children. He said to Kim Il-sung, I'm good with you invading South Korea if Mao is good with it. Go ask Mao. So it's like, if it's okay with mom, it's okay with me, right? So Kim Il-sung goes to Beijing in the spring of 1950 and says, back in late January, Stalin approved of my invasion of South Korea. And Mao said, Stalin approved you. No one told me, and we've always said no to you. So he rips off a cable to Stalin and says, did you approve? And Stalin sends back a cable and says, no, I didn't approve. I said if it was okay with you, it would be okay with me. And that put Mao in this terrible spot. And Mao just decides to give the green light. And the rest is history, as they say. But where Taiwan comes back in is that when the United States crosses the 38th parallel, ignoring Chinese warnings not to do so, because they didn't believe the messenger, they drive into North Korea. Then Mao has another decision to make, which is to send the troops in. And Stalin used Taiwan a lot in his effort to convince Mao to send forces in, and said, you'll lose Taiwan forever if you don't save Kim Il-sung. And the Americans will remilitarize Japan. They'll be in Korea. They'll keep Taiwan away from you forever. You've got to do this. And Mao did it. And And a lot of his colleagues didn't agree with the decision. So it was not a purely obvious Chinese Communist decision. It was a particular Mao decision to go in massive force.
But in a sense, you know, he gave up the opportunity, when he did have all his troops ready to go, he
Yeah,
gave up that.
He had to give it up.
opportunity.
because- Yeah, and he was legitimately afraid that the US was going to drive further if it consolidated power. MacArthur was signaling that, but the US wasn't going to do so. The Truman administration was not ready to attack.
And what about the Chinese attitude today? Do you think that's still in their mind that we'd have to resolve the two China's problem before we resolve the two Koreas?
I don't know about before or after. It was one of the reasons that China objected so strongly to the initial creation of the alliance by the United States with Taiwan, because it seemed to create a permanent separation. And the Chinese actually been directly involved in the division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel in Geneva, right, in 1954. And they had been directly involved in the division of Korea at the 38th parallel in 1953 at Panmunjom. And they said, that doesn't apply to us. We're not going to be permanently divided. They didn't want to be the third country that was divided. So they never accepted the idea that China would be divided between two Chinas, and it's happened to this day. So it's linked up in that way as well. I do think the Korean War, it's my own view. I'm unusual in my field, so I'll label it as such. I do believe that the Korean War effort, Mao's Korean War effort, is very important to CCP legitimacy today. And it's one of the reasons that China is so reluctant to put pressure on North Korea at US behest or the Japanese behest or the South Korean behest or sometimes the Russian, not usually behest. So the argument is that they need to have Mao look good for something, right? You can't cut the umbilical cord entirely back to the 49. And Mao was a terrible political leader as a Cultural Revolution showed. Mao was a disastrous economic leader, killed 45 million Chinese in the Great Leap Forward. So the argument is he was a great strategist. And his poster child strategy for success was he defeated the Americans in freedom. And they seem unwilling to let that go.
You see that in the military museum.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, the whole, yeah.
But
Anyway, so that's a lengthy answer to a very good question. But I think the one piece that Mao did not want to divert forces north for Korea. He just felt like he had to once the war started.
well, yeah, one anecdote is my understanding too is that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not conduct relations with North Korean government. It is the Communist Party International Department that sort of reserves the, you know.
But they're in the lead most of the time. They both do it, but yeah, that's basically
Because
that's a communist
party-to-party
the
relationship.
same with Vietnam. Any communist country. The International Liaison Department. It's called.
In fact, they have a building with Wuxi with a
Yeah.
sign at the top. It's like a
Yeah,
sign. It says Communist Party International
Liaison
Department.
They're powerful people. They're actually in many ways within the party more powerful than the diplomats. Others? Yes, Emily, can you pass her the mic?
You can also try to talk very loud.
No, but it's for the people on.
Yeah, it's for the
remote.
I'm curious, could you talk a bit about your feelings about the growing US-China relationship after this? I'm curious kind of how you view that. Was you try to just tune it out, or was you upset by it? Was you happy about it? That would be very curious to know.
Yeah, I think he was generally quite happy about it. And I think for him, his life in international diplomacy ended as soon as he got out of prison. Maybe after he stopped giving like interviews. But as Tom mentioned, we went to China in 1983. In my dad's mind, as a kind of like public goodwill effort that he hoped would at least contribute kind of nominally towards to this effect, you know. And it was funded by NBC, so the whole thing was televised. It was thinking about it now as
How old were you?
3, and I ended up, Brian Gumbel interviewed us when we returned, and I started yelling at him at one point because I was being very quiet and he was asking me what my favorite part was. And I said, like, the Great Wall. And then he's like, I don't understand. And eventually I'm like yelling, the Great Wall. But you know, and there were, so it was documented throughout. There were reporters with us as well from the US. And I think for him, the meeting with Wang Bingnan, I mean, in addition to kind of like blowing his mind in terms of like revealing information that he might have suspected a little bit, but hadn't gotten any kind of confirmation. I mean, in his mind, that was a reparative gesture, you know. So I think he would have been overwhelmingly in favor of opening up relationships. Yeah, and he was. I mean, even, you know, before, I mean, in the early 2000s, you know, when there was a lot of movement there, that I think he was generally in favor of the idea of it, you know, which is different than being, I think he had questions about the government, you know, but in terms of general openness, I think he's, yeah.
So there's a friend of Colombia who is Wang Bingnan's son, right? Wang Boming. You know, he has made this case that we need to have diplomatic contacts all the time, and he talks about his father's negotiations with Alexis Johnson as the key example. There are other things in the experience that he has in prison that I write about, because he sees little aspects of what's going on in China from his prison cell. And one is that his food rations go down in like 1959. Like, why? It's a great leap forward. He doesn't have no idea that the country has had massive starvation, right? And then the other thing he sees is the Cultural Revolution, because he has a handler named Miss, that they call Miss, who is a highly educated, probably upper middle class elite before the revolution, and becomes a communist, and has as her job to handle these American prisoners who don't speak Chinese. And he describes how early on in their relationship, she seemed kind of condescending towards her comrades, you know, kind of snooty. And she pays a very heavy price in the Cultural Revolution. She gets to carry the night soil in the prison. She gets struggled against in the courtyard. And they witness this, and that's a kind of a miniature view of the Cultural Revolution from inside a prison. And Wang Bingnan, his wife, is basically murdered during the Cultural Revolution. They call it forced suicide. And he tells your father that when that his wife passed away in the Cultural Revolution in 1983. So there's a lot of connections to the drama that is China's domestic development inside the story. I think that's one of the most amazing things about your dad, though, is that he went through this traumatic experience. I can easily have said, ain't no way I'm taking a plane back into China.
Yeah.
Right? Just of all the places, I'll go anywhere, right? Right? But he went back and he seemed cheerful about it.
Yeah, he was cheerful. I mean, he was a congenitally cheerful person, which is, I think, maybe it goes back to the question about his psychology, you know.
There is a question on.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is actually from one of our CWP fellows' dads, who still apparently pays a lot. Last year's
Current?
fellows-
One of these guys says?
No, Steve
Oh.
Canfield.
Okay.
He says, this is such a fascinating book on many levels. Thank you for collaborating on it. In Vietnam, the US repeated the idiocy of inserting Viet allies in North Vietnam with the same failed results. Mr. Downey seems to deal with the interrogation in a very practical manner. It did not harm the US and helped him avoid physical torture. After the Korean War, the US adopted a strict military code of conduct, which turned out to be counterproductive. You think the US learned from your dad, Jack Downey's experience?
I'd say one thing they learned never to send someone like Mr. Downey over Chinese territory again. Even when they were doing Tibetan operations with the Mustangs, I look at Tendor here. I don't know why I'm looking at Tendor here. I shouldn't be doing that. Even when they were doing that, they didn't send Americans over Chinese airspace again. So when I call it, my first chapter is called An American Hero on a Fool's Mission. So I kind of check my own self-judgmental conclusion and say, well, the CIA came to the same conclusion that this was a fool's mission. So they definitely learned a lesson not to do this again, right? He did confess. And he was told in his training that if you're captured for a long time, eventually you will confess. So he tried to come up with the best way to confess to do the least damage to the United States. And the way he did that is he confessed very fulsomely. He confessed in every micro detail of his operation and every personality that he met in all these different places in such detail that he overwhelmed the recipients of the information, and they couldn't sort out what was important and what wasn't important. And it was volumes and volumes of confession. And by the time he came around to being, quote unquote, broken into confessing, and then finished this giant thing, Peter can confirm this, that the actual operations he was describing would have changed. So these types of operations only last for a limited amount of time, and then they change their approach. So he wasn't actually revealing that much that was useful to the Chinese government, but he did confess. He was treated, from what I can tell from Vietnam POW stories, that he was treated better in general in terms of physical treatment than people were treated in very horrible conditions in the Hanoi Hilton. But as Jack Lee said, in the first 2 years, it was pretty rough. I mean, it wasn't torture, but it was right on the borderline. It got more predictable and less scary later for him. There were other prisoners who were there who were treated worse, including a gentleman named Hugh Redmond, who had been captured in 1951, who apparently was a spy as well. I write about it in my section. And he was much more resistant to the Chinese communists and was short on food a lot of the time. And Mr. Downey, Mr. Fecteau would sneak him food in the exercise area to keep him around. But he died tragically in 1970 before the negotiations to let people out. And there's a park named after him, I think, is it Yonkers? I forget which town. Just yeah. He had been a hero in World War II, and then he signed on to spy work afterwards. He had been a combat hero in World War II. Yeah, go ahead, Tinder. Sorry to look at you like a Mustang.
Oh, no worries. I remember, Jack, your own experience working as a supporter of human rights in China. Support the Tibetan cause. I remember in 2007 and 2008 when there were pretty big number of Americans and Canadians and some Tibetans going to China in the time leading up to the Olympics to participate in protests, basically, right? You were there as well, and depending on how you get caught, there was no guarantee that people who get caught or detained, once you get detained, you would be let out anytime soon. It was a pretty risky thing to do, in fact, right? Based on his own experience, did your dad try to or not try to discourage you from participating in those activities?
It's a good question.
Oh, you have a mic.
I've got this. Yeah. Well, I think in 2007 and 2008, because I was in Beijing both summers during times where there were protests, I didn't tell my parents before I went. So he could not have discouraged me or encouraged me. But retrospectively, so in 2008, I was arrested and detained and deported from
Really?
Beijing. Oh yeah, we didn't talk about that.
Yeah. These meetings are eye-opening.
From Beijing and then sent to Hong Kong, where I was detained again in the airport jail. And then, so once I got out, it eventually came around to like notifying my parents, partially because a friend of ours, a family friend of ours at the time was ambassador. And so we realized it was like likely that like it would get around to my dad at some point. whether it was through me or through family friends. And it's probably better.
It was Sandy Rand.
Yeah, Sandy Rand. And probably better not to come from Sandy and to come from the child that was recently kicked out of his literal motherland. I think, I mean, of course, there's like general concern. And I think there was some residual like angst, but we actually, it was the greatest memory I have was just us bonding over talking about being interrogated, and if you've ever been interrogated in your like native language, it's much harder to come up to answer questions when you're being interrogated for me in English than it would be through a translator. And so we kind of like reminisced about interrogation stories. He was very mild mannered and very I think he respected the commitment, I think he did not want me to be in Chinese prison forever. So I mean, we kind of chuckled around it, and he's like, just you could psychoanalyze my family like very easily. He marries a Chinese person, I grow up and I get arrested in China for doing human rights things. So we joked about it. I'm sure he would have been incredibly stressed out if he had known in advance that I was going in, but who would tell their parent they were about to do that?
It's kind of incredible you say, because I now know your case. I didn't connect any names. I was a deputy assistant secretary at the time when you got deported. And I remember you getting deported.
That's interesting.
And I didn't realize it was you, or didn't know at that time. I didn't really know your dad's story. So, wow, small world.
Why did you get deported?
I thought I was minding my own business, but so I was working for some Tibetan human rights organizations in the up run to the Beijing Olympics, and so I was part of like a group that was planning some things. Yeah.
So if you recall, there were actual social movement riots in Lhasa in early 2008, and so it was we restarted the human rights dialogue that spring. So these topics were high on our agenda.
Another thing interesting, and of course, that was tied in with the Olympics. The European left, of course, are very critical of trying Karl Marx, and so the Greens from Germany came down to Paris when the torch went in the city of Paris. The mayor put the Tibet flag on the city hall, and so trying to create a defense pact, particularly that the European left was siding with Tibet and they claiming that China's betraying Karl Marx. So that's pretty. But what I wanted to ask was the U2 program. So after this, U2 pilots, of course, incurred the same danger of being captured. So they had to Gary Powers and so was there some deja vu in terms of CIA saying now when we get another guy captured, what do we do about this program?
Yeah, the U2, if you look at John Delurie's excellent book, his book's really good.
Yes.
He talks about how the capture of the U2 pilots scrapped the possibility of Gary Powers over the Soviet Union, scrapped the possibility of a prisoner exchange with the Chinese communists that might have gotten because Gary Powers became the target that they had. The person they had to get out, and so that he talks about that. I don't know the details well enough, but I read it. I read his book, John Delurie's book, just 2 weeks ago, and we talked about the connections. But they also tried to train KMT pilots to fly surveillance planes as well, so that they didn't have to send Americans to space again. And it's really the record in Tibet is really bad too, in terms of the number of people that were sent in by the US CIA programs and the number of people who were killed or captured and what they accomplished. And I had the privilege of meeting a bunch of retired Mustangs at Harvard when I was an MIT professor on Sunday morning. And they were basically all just sent out to camps on the border with Nepal by the CIA and largely abandoned. And they were not too happy about their experience having worked with the US government, but they were good enough to come to to come to Harvard and talk about their experience. Did you get to meet the Beastie Boy in your?
Well, not as such. I did one time, actually, I think it was when I was in college. So Adam Yauch, also known as Ad Rock, was one of the Beastie Boys who was married to a Tibetan woman. And when I was in college, I was on a Tibetan studies program in northern India in Dharamsala. And I was living with a host family at the time. And one time my host mother came in and she was like very excited. And she was like, Jackla, the Backstreet Boys are in Dharamsala. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, there's one of the Backstreet Boys. He's a big supporter of Tibet. He's married. He has a Tibetan wife and they're here. And I was like, I don't think that's true. And then I was walking around and I did run into Adam Yauch on the street, you know, in Upper Dharamsala. That was the closest thing.
So I gave a talk on this panel with the Mustangs at Harvard on Sunday morning, and someone asked a question in the back of the room. And it was a big audience. It was a big auditorium, so I couldn't see the person. So I leaned over to this hardened Mustang who had become a monk. And I said, who asked the question? And the accent and all, he said to me, it was the Beastie Boy. And I said, excuse me? And he said, it was the Beastie Boy. And I knew what he said the second time. And I said, he just said to me, it was the Beastie Boy, which is like the sentence I would have least expected. Right? And then I got to meet him. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, very nice man.
Yeah.
He passed away tragically,
Right.
very young.
We can continue over dinner, but I think.
Yeah. Anything online? Nothing?
No.
Okay.
The
Yeah,
Beastie Boys are a good
we'll
way
get
to
dinner,
wrap.
but the rule is that the guest and I get to get the food first so that we
Oh.
can answer your questions.